So let me just tell you how did I ever get interested in St. Bart? You know, I'm a North American from the Northeast. I, like most Americans, had never heard of St. Bart before. But I was doing my doctoral dissertation on language change and language contact, what happens when languages are in contact with each other and how they can change as part of that contact. And I happened to find this book by Arnold Highfield, which I bought and read with great interest. And he is now in St. Croix, I didn't understand. There's an interesting expansion of this room that's going on in the back there. Very creative. So I read Highfield's book, and I asked myself, well, he was writing about a language which is called St. Thomas French dialect, that comes from St. Bart, but he's in St. Thomas. And why is he talking about or writing about a language from St. Bart, and he's not going there? So I thought, well, I have young children, and I was not in a position to take off immediately and go pursue my interests. And I had a full-time job as an administrator at a college, so I had to wait until I had the opportunity to go to St. Bart and get some of those questions answered. And when I first went, I thought, well, I'll just stay a week. I'll talk to some people about the language situation there. Maybe I'll make some recordings, because to study a language as a linguist, you have to record speakers. And sometimes that's difficult to do. People are not jumping up and down and grabbing my microphone to be recorded. But I thought, oh well, a week or so, I'll get a picture of the whole situation. Well, I was very wrong about that. I was able to record one woman, from Coruscant, the first time I went. And I found in just that week that there were a bunch of different languages being spoken on St. Bart. And they weren't all the same language. So there were people over on the East End who were speaking French Creole, I thought, I wasn't sure. There were people in the Western End speaking a kind of traditional French dialect. There were people in the town of Gustavio speaking nothing but English. And then around the area called Saline, where the salt marshes are, there was another kind of French being spoken there. And I didn't come back with a gazillion copies of recordings. I had great difficulty getting people to be recorded, but I knew that I had a lot of questions about St. Bart. It was an absolutely fascinating place. Plus, it's beautiful, but mainly it's got some remarkable citizens. The questions I wanted to get answered is, how can you, in a small population, have this variety of languages spoken, and not a lot of bilinguals? You would think in a small community you would have some people who spoke both patois and French Creole, or both English and Saline French, but no, that's not what it was. So what linguists learn from such a situation is that there must be some social conditions, some social divisions in this population that sustains these distinct languages over a long period of time. But the people I spoke to said, oh, we don't have any divisions, we're just all St. Barts. So I thought, well, I don't know, I gotta find out about this. So I went back and did some historical research, and the first question was, where did the St. Barts come from? And of course, they came from France, obviously, but what took some time to discern was, did they come from different parts of France? Did they come at different times? What is the source of the situation in France that they came from? And as I assume all of you know, the first settlement of the French and the English was in St. Kitts in 1625. And their motive for coming to the Caribbean was a very greedy one. The Spanish were sending home all kinds of gold and jewels and fantastic wealth. Well, the French and the English decided they wanted some part of that money pot. And so they came to, okay, let me pay attention to this. No, we know it's Sunday, November 17th. We need to click it again. Here we go. So, here's the map of St. Bart. Whoops, I'm walking out of the line of sight here. So, the French and the English occupied St. Kitts in the beginning. At first, they collaborated trying to get rid of the Caribs. Once the Caribs were gone, the French and the English started fighting with each other, and they spent 100 years at that project. So they eventually St. Kitts becomes all English, and the French are sent out basically. They were it's the French governor who decided that, well, he had the opportunity, he better get a hold of St. Martin and St. Bart islands. Basically as a strategic move. It was never imagined that those islands could be serious plantation islands. They were just in the right spot to be able to raid Spanish galleons when they went through the Windward Passage, or the, it's not the Windward Passage, but, some settlers from St. Kitts arrived in St. Bart, and they would have left France at the time of Louis XIV, when he was building the grandiose Palace of Versailles. But 4/5 of the population of France at that time were landless peasants, poor, and their only opportunity as they saw this expansion to the New World was to sign up as indentured servants, or engagés, as the French report that. And the early occupants of the island of St. Bart had, there were some wealthy settlers who arrived with slaves, but those people left. And the ones who remained, as we see in our list of 1681, are the ones who had no slaves, had very minimal livestock, minimal possessions. So let me stop and say something about the map here. This, essentially you have to think of St. Bart as in three pieces. From this area north, as they're often called the northern quartier, where the patois speakers are. From this area east is where the Creole speakers are. This, of course, is the town of Gustavia, where people speak English. And this is Saline area, kind of isolated to some degree, where there's another French variety spoken, which may be basically gone by now. So you arrive on St. Bart. How many of you have flown into St. Bart? Ooh, a lot of you know what fun that is. Okay, so here's what it looks like. And it looks like that landing strip is never going to be long enough. But you make it. And the town of Gustavia is a very pretty place. The only reason the French were really interested in St. Bart was that it had a good port. And St. Kitts didn't really have a good port. So this was valuable. But the big problem was water. They had absolutely no water. So what you find oh, that didn't turn out very well. People who have the hard copy can see the cactus picture better than this. Everything, the only thing that grows on St. Barth is cactus. They've got lots of cactus. And the hillsides are very bare, much barer than St. Thomas. Got another picture there. And this is Grand Fond, very rocky coast there. And one of the first roads built in St. Bart went along this hillside, and it was an amazement to everybody. But what you have to have if you live in St. Bart is you have to have pipes, water collection around your house. So there are lots of examples of little houses with elaborate water systems and going into a cistern under the house, which is until very recently when they built a desalination plant. This was the only way you got water, was to collect it from rather infrequent rainfalls. So we know that the settlers came to St. Bart from St. Kitts, that they were trying to hold strategic territories for the French during the French and English wars. But we really need to know more than that to figure out what's the source of this language difference. So we have only one document, that goes back into the 17th century. That's the census of 1681, and Sophia has found that online. So if you are interested in taking a more careful look at that document, it's very interesting. In that census, there are 66 family names, and 23 of them owned slaves. They all had wives, but nobody ever gives us the names of the wives. The ones who had slaves did not stay on St. Bart. In the next censuses, you see that those people are gone. And the only three names that we have from the original 1681 documents are Aubin and Clayot and Bernier, excuse me. And what we can find from that census is that the Aubin, and I take no position on the question of whether it's A-I-N or I-N. Everybody in St. Bart simply says Aubin. And they don't, a lot of the older people don't write anyway, so it's never a question about how to spell it.
Get a copy of it.
The Aubins, there are two brothers, according to the research done by DeVaux in the 1970s. They are from Toulon on the Mediterranean coast in France. Pierre was signed up to be an engagé in St. Kitts in 1645, and both brothers appear in the census, the St. Kitts census in 1660. Bernier's, Jean, we first find him in Marie Galante in 1664, and he comes from an area in central France, and he has a wife who was born in Guadeloupe. Now this is kind of interesting because the men went over usually without wives, or never with wives since they were just indentured servants. But their children start to be born on these islands, miraculously enough. And the daughters of some of those earliest settlers have daughters who, by 1664, are getting married and ending up on St. Bart. So that's the story with Bernier. And there's a lot of moving from island to island, and we find that he is probably a younger son who was in St. Bart by the time of the census in 1681, but probably an older son, or no, probably Jean Bernier Sr., was still in St. Croix at that time with a wife and 6 children. But that whole family arrives in St. Bart in 1682. And the Grayos, they are in St. Kitts in 1671. Jacques has a wife, 4 sons and a daughter, a cow and a calf, but no slaves. And his origins, according to Deveau, are probably in the Vendée, the western coast of France. And the Grayot family were early commanders of the population, so they obviously have established themselves as an important part of the population. So on the back side of your handout is a painfully reconstructed list of where people were living in 1788. Now, 1788 is right after the Swedes take over the island, and they keep records. Oh man, they have got censuses, reports, lists, a whole lot of stuff, which, thanks to Per Tinbrand, have become available to us, who are not Swedish speakers. And so I tracked down each mention of these surnames and found out where they were living. And what you can see from this list is there's a very important dichotomy of these names in terms of where people live. The Aubin only lived in the Auvent area. If you remember, that's the eastern side of the island. The Berniers lived mostly either in Auvent or in the center. And of course, these are Creole-speaking sectors. The Grayots are not in Auvent at all, but almost 100% in the Soulevant section. And if you look at these names, you'll see that the families really clustered in particular parts of the island. The number, say, after about 25, means that there were 25 individuals with that name in that sector in 1788. And so, that's kind of interesting, that we have, first of all, this maintenance of these early names into the 18th century, and that they are clustered in particular parts of the island. But this doesn't tell us much about the language differences, because what we know is the first settlers all came from France, and when we study these distributions, we see that they, it's not all the people from northern France that settled in one particular area. The distribution of these settlers is pretty much island-wide, and there's no particular group that came at a certain time, and another group came at another time. So we don't we've got some interesting information about who these people are, but we don't see a pattern there with how they have settled. So the next thing we need to know is, how did the population become so fragmented? And there are two main historical events involved here. Number one was during the wars with the English, 100 St. Barths left the island and went to Martinique. There wasn't enough land in Martinique, so they went on to St. Vincent. And they stayed there for 20 or more years. We don't know exactly which people left St. Bart at that time, but it's likely that it was the people on the eastern side of the island, because that, in terms of being raided by English warriors, it's easier to access that part of the island than the area in the west, which is more mountainous, or where people could see the English coming and head to the hills. So it's likely that it was the Creole speaking, they aren't Creole speaking yet, but those on the eastern part of the island left. And 100 people is a significant number in those days. So that was in 1747. In 1763, we have another peace. There's constantly peace being announced with the English, but those don't last very long. However, 1763 was a significant departure, and the islands were sorted out. So St. Vincent becomes English, and everybody who's not English has to leave. And it's at this point that these St. Barts came back to St. Bart. Well, they came back having spent 20 years in a sugar plantation environment with lots of slaves, lots of contact with people from Martinique. And it's probably the case that they came back to St. Bart. Well, we know it's the case they came back to St. Bart with lots of slaves, because that appears in the census data. But also, they came back having had a very different experience in the Caribbean than the experience they had before they left. So they come back having been farmers, planters, slave owners, and being Creole speakers, my theory. And they settled, you can tell from the census data that they all settled in the eastern area of St. Bart, and that is the Creole speaking area today. So there's where Creole comes from. Second historical fact is that the French sell the island to Sweden. How would it feel like to wake up one morning and find out that you're Swedish? Not a place you'd ever heard of, probably. But the Swedes come in. They are not interested in colonizing the island. They've got a good commercial trade, and they need an outlet for some of their trade in the Caribbean. They asked for Martinique. They didn't get it. They got St. Bart. And so their response was, okay, we're going to, there's not much of a population here, and not much going on, so we're going to encourage English from the local islands to come and settle in St. Bart. And they did this in a very clever way. They said, anybody who would like to settle on St. Bart will be absolved of all their debts. So people came in hordes, and the whole town, there was not really a town before the Swedes came, but suddenly there was a town named for the Swedish king Gustav, and they had lots of English-speaking colonists settling there. There were lots of slaves. There was a lot of commerce going on. The timing was very good for Miss Wheat's part because the English had just banned their islands from commerce with North America. And most islands at that time, this is 1788 and through there, they relied on North America for lumber, for all kinds of tools and stuff like that. Well, suddenly they're cut off. And so what do they have? They have Swedish stuff in St. Bart, close by. So, but there was an interesting phenomenon there, as Sophia was telling me on the way here, where St. Thomas has a distinction between the town and the country. St. Bart also had a major distinction. The town was English-speaking and quite diverse population. And every report that the Swedes write back to the king says, from time to time they say something about the country, but they really seriously were not interested in the country. The country, being everywhere but Gustavia, continued to be French related and French connected. So now I have skipped over some slides and I have to catch up with myself here. Oh, we're back to the beginning. I have messed up. Okay.
You just want to start from here?
Yeah, let's
Okay.
start from there. All right, we've seen about the water connection.
Okay.
Where do I want to get? That one. I thought that's what I did. Okay, so one of the earliest buildings in St. Bart was the church. This is the old French church, as the Swedes refer to it, and this is in Lorient, and it was a very collective effort to build a church, and it's the church, the Catholicism of the population has always been a very significant part of what goes on there. Now I'm missing something. Let's see what happens next. Oh, this is just another picture of a sample house, a typical house in St. Bart with a water collection system. And this is the house of my friend Bernadette, who is one of my informants. We linguists talk about people who are willing to be recorded and studied informants. So she and this is typical little altars that you find in the Auvent area. And this is another question I have not answered, is why are the Auvent residents, the Creole speakers, so much devoted to little altars along the roadway, more active in the church than I'm told the patois speakers are. So this is my major patois speaker from Colombier. He was called Petit Père. I don't know if any knew him.
Great grandfather.
Ah, he was wonderful. He was just a remarkable art informant, talking about his adventures in his fishing boats. Fantastic. And this is my Creole informant, Bernadette. And you can see that there's no visual distinction between the patois speakers and the Creole speakers. And Bernadette told me that she lived with her mother until her mother died, and her sister was in St. Thomas, and her sister invited her to come and spend some time with her on St. Thomas. And when she describes her experience on St. Thomas, it's very, this will strike you as very real. She said, "Oh, that's another country. They have rain. You can grow things there. There's fruit. There's vegetables." It was like she had just stepped off the planet into a whole other environment. She was a great informant as well. So, we know where the languages came from, where the English came from. The Creole, the patois was probably the original French variety spoken in the western part of the island. But we still don't know why these languages remained so distinct for so long. It's about 250 years. And there was plenty of opportunity for those folks to talk to each other or to share their experiences. And when you ask people on St. Bart, why is this so? Why are there these different languages? And they say, "Oh, I don't know, it's just always been that way." So it takes a lot of, this is sort of the sociolinguistic part of this research. It takes a lot of getting to know people, the historical research, but also trying to figure out what kinds of interactions there are between people on this island. And one of the things that strikes you quickly is that they, particularly in the documentation during the Swedish period, there's a lot of talk about, we don't have any schools on this island. There are a lot of people who are illiterate. What are we going to do about this? So letters go off from the governors to the king, and the king says, "I'll give you some money to build a school." So they build a school in Gustavia. And first thing they do, what is that? They invite professors from Sweden to come down and teach in the school. And the governor says, "We're going to use Swedish as our means of instruction." Well, you can probably imagine how well that went over with the parents, particularly in the town, who spoke either English or French, but almost nobody ever spoke Swedish on St. Bart. So there was a lot of going back and forth. The first professor said, "It's too hot here, I can't stand it, I'm going home." The next one said, "Oh, these people are stupid, I can't teach them, I'm going home." And finally, they made the smart decision to hire local people to teach in their schools. And the Catholic Church really helped out with their sending nuns from Guadeloupe to start a French school. But this took a long time. And where the other islands had started schools, in the early 1800s, in St. Bart, there was no system of public education. There were just, spotty kinds of attempts at education because of these language differences that people couldn't resolve, and the Swedes never resolved them. Another factor that contributed to the distinction in languages was women's lives. A lot of the people I interviewed were older women in their 70s and 80s, and it still continues. This pattern continues somewhat to this day. But if you were a woman, you had your children, and you stayed in your quartier. You didn't go around visiting neighbors outside of the quartier. You were strongly rooted in this little neighborhood where your family was and your husband's family was. And then the men because the island was so desperately poor, the men all went off to work on other islands, principally St. Thomas. And they didn't come back very often. What they say is just in time to make another baby, and they went back to St. Thomas again. So the women who are teaching their children to speak are not engaged with broad-ranged contacts with, certainly not with outsiders or even people outside of their neighborhoods. And of course the French inheritance laws contribute to this fragmentation of the community. The French law says every child inherits equal. So if you have a big family, as many of them did, and you had a little plot of land, it got divided up very quickly. You didn't buy a property somewhere else, or you didn't, basically you were pretty held within the community that you grew up in. And when we study the statistics, there's very little sign of cross-island marriages. You married somebody from the sector you were in. So these things contribute to the persistence of a local language or a local dialect. Of course, the poverty in St. Bart was enormous, was shocking to many people who visited there in the early 1900s. And it was a huge problem for the population as a whole. But what I learned from doing this research is, first of all, the amazing resilience of this population, the courage and the determination that helped them survive these obstacles. But also, what I learned is that about language change is that if you're in a small society without much diversification, you're struggling to survive looking for the same resources that everybody else is looking for. So there's no advantage to collaborating or trying to work something out with a neighbor. And that's this phenomenon that Emile Durkheim talks about in terms of small communities and their social patterns and larger, more diverse communities. And what you see happening is that as a society develops economically, there are more opportunities to develop more complex social networks. And so instead of your social environment being your neighbors or your family, as the economy expands, you have reason to work with people in your same occupation, or people, teachers getting together, or networks of relationships that cross territorial boundaries. And this is what is happening in St. Bart today. As the tourism business has taken over, you see people interacting across a broader network, and you find people actually marrying somebody from Auvon or somebody from Soulevant. And right now in St. Bart, it's kind of hard to tell who are the real St. Barts, because people have married across boundaries and their kids interact with children from other areas, so it's no longer a single society, or small traditional society. It is a much more diverse and complex society. And along with that change, languages, the dialects die out. People don't see the advantage of maintaining their creoles or their patois. They all speak French, which is the main unifying language on the island. So I've talked longer than I intended to. Sorry about that. But I would be very glad to have your comments and questions and disagreements for any of this.
You made a comment earlier about the airport. I could remember being probably 7, 8 years old flying up there most every summer. And right now it's great. Before we could only get in there in like a little 3-4 seater plane. And the hill, which you think is kind of close to the airport, was even higher.
Was it?
The planes would actually come in about 20-25 feet above the roofs of the cars. And they didn't have weed eaters and they didn't have lawnmowers. The goats, besides trying to land on that airport, you were like telling the goats, get out the way, we want to land. You know, because like I said, there was no weed eaters, no lawnmowers. And that was the actual weed eater and the lawnmower. So I just wanted to share that with you. If you think you had an episode, we did just about every summer go up for a period of time.
That's wonderful. It's a wonderful story. Yes.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear you describe the separation. It's interesting to hear how you
Maybe if you stand up.
yeah, how you describe the separation and isolation of the various groups, because essentially that was similar to what we found here in St. Thomas. I don't know if you're familiar with St. Thomas. We had a French town in which you had certain French names that always appeared there, and then you had the north side, and one could always tell by the name of the individual whether they were from Frenchtown or whether they were from the north side. And those separations remained for a very, very long time. It is only essentially in recent years that you had people moving out of those communities and mingling so that you don't find that separation. But it would be interesting to know whether indeed the people in Frenchtown came from a specific portion or whether they came from several different sections. And the same is true for the north side. That is how those two populations were peopled from St. Barths. I don't know if there are any people here who can address that particular issue. So it would be interesting to know whether those separations remained on St. Thomas that you found there. And then once you answer that, I have a question. I was interested, I didn't know that slavery existed on St. Barths. And so I would be interested to know what happened to those slaves when the French who had them left. Did they leave them on St. Barths? Is there a group of individuals who are descendants of those slaves who are currently living there, or did all the slaves leave St. Barths? So 2 questions.
Good questions. Good questions. I think you can find on this sheet of paper the origins of the divisions on St. Thomas. And I think you'll find the ones in Sullivan are the ones who went to Frenchtown. They were fishermen, and they stayed together. Now I may be wrong because I have spent some time in the library here in St. Thomas, and I recorded at least one person here. But from what I saw, it was typically the Magras, the Grayos, the ones who you see here under Sullivan, Donette, of whom we have a representative with us today. So what had happened already before people started leaving for St. Thomas is that the two communities, because of the poverty, the two communities kind of had separate occupations. The people in Sullivan, the western part they had good little harbors, and they made their own nice little boats, and they were very proficient fishermen. And even a man from Gustavia told me that we couldn't manage those little boats. Those people, those people from Sullivan were expert at managing these little boats, going out and emptying their traps in foul weather. But when I talked to the men in Auvent, and here you've got Berniers and Berries and Blanc and Laplaces, they weren't interested in fishing. That's the one guy told me. I said, didn't you do some fishing when you were young? And he said, no, we didn't. They raised animals mainly. So cows, beef, and they shipped those to what we call the sugar islands, because the sugar islands never really had enough room to raise food for their populations. So there was a very clear distinction, a difference, even though everybody fished and everybody raised vegetables, but still the expertise was quite distinct between the fishermen and the farmers, and it was the farmers who went up to Northside. And your second question was?
Slavery on St. Barths.
Yes. It's very clear from the censuses that there were lots of slaves on St. Bart. Not when we look at the history of the Caribbean, where the tipping point about Creole languages and slavery is that if more than half of your population is African descendant, the chances are that the Creole is going to be the dominant language in that community. And so St. Bart had slaves, but never more than 50%. So there, and what became of them? There's still, people told me that there's some areas that were typically African American, African French. Sorry about that. But there's not much left. Most of what people told me, most of the black population was in Gustavia, and they came in with these English settlers who came when the Swedes came in. So, but when the economy got bad, which happened fairly quickly in St. Paul, those English planters left and took their slaves with them. But there were 500, I have a list of 500 slaves who freed on St. Bart in 1846, 46 and 47. Their names, the slave owners' names, where they were born. These are in the Swedish archives, or in my bottom file drawer about this thick. But generally, the economy was bad, and they were smart enough to leave. The numbers of blacks, and then in doing historical research in the French, in French history, there comes a point, it might be 1945 or it might be before that, where you can no longer list people racially in the population statistics. So you don't really know anymore how many African Americans there are.
They're not African Americans.
That's
They're not
I'm
African Americans, they were black.
Sorry about that. Yes. Yes.
First of all, I'd like to commend you on taking the time out to actually put all of this information together because it was truly insightful.
Thank you.
I don't have one of the sheets, but peeking over at the table on the back of the sheet, I saw the McGrath family and the possible origin being Ireland. And I thought that stood out. And it was even more interesting because that is my family. What is the story behind the fact?
Well, very, very good question, and it's one that I don't think anybody has sorted out. Even DeVoe, who has, spent some time talking about the family names and where they came from. But people I consult who are French people in the U.S., they look at that and they say, well, you know, it could be a French name. Or it could be like a McGraw or something like that. And I don't think anybody, but maybe she has the answer.
I have something to say. The Irish brought 600 Irish people from St. Kitts when the English and the French were having their battles, and they took them to St. Bart.
Mhm, mhm.
And we even have on St. Bart an Irish building, a wall building. So actually they really came directly from Ireland. They did not come through France. These people came directly from Ireland. They were brought as religious prisoners,
Mhm.
slaves more or less.
Mhm. That's altogether possible.
In 1666, that's when it really, the Irish were there in St. Bart.
Mhm, mhm.
They eventually left and they went to Montserrat and other islands.
Yes, right.
That I know for a fact.
Yes, I know that that's been documented on other islands. There's just nothing concrete about the McGraw name, but
Yes, there
it's
is.
quite possible.
There is. I can tell you that there is something concrete about it because I have researched it.
Mhm,
And therefore I know.
mhm. Okay.
If anyone doesn't have a copy of the handout, we can make more before you go. So we
Yes.
can get those to you quick.
I also have two questions. The first one, what is Bernadette's last name?
Laplace.
Okay. And then my second one is, did you find anything on the last name Bryan, which is a common last name here? And I was told that it started as Bryn and then in translation went to Bryan, but any confirmation?
And how do you spell it here?
Well, we have both last names. We have Bryn and then we also have Bryan, Bryan.
Yeah. And that sounds more Swedish, excuse me, Scots or the Bryan part.
Okay.
But I don't know, I've talked to the Bryan folks. I thought there might have been a possibility that it was Brown because of the similar meaning.
Okay.
But I have, okay, let's hear other opinions here.
I can answer on that.
Okay.
It is Bryn.
It
There
is
were, in all the research I found one single name recorded as Bryan in St. Bart's. When the census was being taken here on the island, when you go through the census of all the way back into 1910, what you see is whoever was taking the census at that time did not speak French. So what they did with first and last names is they phonetically sounded it out. So in that process of going through the 1910, 1917, they call it 1920, but it really is 1917 and the 1930 census, I have found, because I've done a lot of genealogy, I have found it happening with the first and last names. And I've also found when you're researching, the middle names is what was people were commonly known by, not by their first names. So when the census taker would ask, what is your name? They would never, because of the thick accent and the language barrier, they would never get it across to what is your full formal name. So one time the census would appear with somebody's middle name, and the next time the census would appear with their first name, and the next time the census would appear with the nicknames that we know them as. And the only thing that identifies the who's who is the children. Because you see the progression of the same children. The males are usually the correct name, but the females' names are flipping all over the place. But every Bryan is actually Bryn. That is coming from
Here.
St. Bart.
The question is really more complicated than that because Bryn, there's no Bryn that's ever been found in France. And so there is an additional theory where some misguided priest, French priest, when he heard one, he thought that perhaps the man had been influenced by French Creole that doesn't pronounce the R's. And so he put in an R where there was none. and that the real French name is Bouin. B-O-U-I-N,
I've seen that.
which exists in French.
And one other thing, Ancestry is now putting all of these names into typewritten, and they have now changed Brian to Beyond, B-E-Y-O-N in Ancestry.com. So it's further, the name is further getting switched.
Right. Well, we have a lot of that in the United States with immigrants coming in and whoever was writing their names down not having a clue. So, yes.
I am curious as to when obeying was switched, because that was the AUDIN.
Well, my only source on that is DeVoe, and he lists both the AIN and the IN, because on different islands, there's evidence of both of those spellings.
Because both names, I don't believe Oben and Oben, that was never changed. The two separate names.
Could very well be.
Because Oben, according to what I researched, said comes from Toulon.
Right.
And you see it, like I explained to you, it's a cathedral called Saint Oben in the north, southern part of Belgium. And there's a Saint Oben also who were beheaded, but he came from Morocco. And even more so, since the name is there, I know of some family of mine, it would happen to me once when I was in Venezuela, they thought we were Arabs. But the name was, and I have two laws
Yes.
right across from, it's right across from Morocco.
My hearing isn't that great, but I'd like to go back to what you said earlier. I think you said they had to get rid of the Caribs.
Yes.
Okay, I think that was a very kind thing to say about France, because the Carib expulsion was one of the worst in history. They slaughtered them.
Yes.
But there are still some people in St. Barths and from St. Barths that have Carib, some Carib in them.
Really?
That is correct.
Interesting.
Now, what I'd like to say is, you said at no time the slaves numbered more than 50%?
Right.
Okay, in this paper here that I have the census,
Yeah, that didn't list the slaves.
huh?
That doesn't list slaves.
It doesn't list slaves?
No, in my handout, you mean?
No.
Oh, no, he's
No,
passing
no,
around.
that's
Oh,
the 1681
Yes,
census.
right.
Just a quick look at it tells me that at that census, there were at least 50% or more of enslaved Africans. For instance, the second one, Mr. Renault, it says he had deux garçons, 4 filles, which means 2 sons, 4 daughters, 3 enslaved African males, 3 enslaved African females, 1 enslaved African young man or child, boy, 3 enslaved African girls, and 1 mulatresse, which is a female mixture between African and Caucasian. And then it goes on to say he had 3 bulls, 10 cows, and 9 calves. But what I'm saying is,
In order of importance.
upon to this here, I believe if you count what you have here, I think it's at least, it's more than 50%.
Well, I'd have to go back. I have not seen that version of,
Okay.
but there is, in the book, there is a list.
Okay, and from my readings, I believe that the difference in the language of the people au vent, they speak the patois, has a direct correlation with the amount of slaves that were in the area. The reason I say so is the patois they speak is quite similar to the patois of Haiti, the patois of Dominica, and St. Lucia, and Guadeloupe, not necessarily Martinique.
Mhm.
but it is quite similar. So there has to be a connection between the people of those islands and Haiti
Well,
and the people in St. Bart's.
yes, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the origins of the Haitian Creole, Guadeloupean Creole, St. Lucian Creole. From what I have seen, the St. Bart Creole has similarities to Guadeloupe Creole,
Yes.
similarities to Martinique Creole, but not so much similarities to Haiti.
Well, I've been able to converse speaking the patois, the people from Haiti, and they understand me well enough. Of course, when it's a group of them talking frequently, then I get lost.
Yeah, me too.
But there is a lot of similarity. They can understand what I'm saying, and I can understand what they're saying if they take the time.
Now, when you say patois, you don't mean the St. Bart patois.
Yes, from the Monde du Vent.
All right, yeah, there's confusion in St. Bart very often. Patois in St. Bart means the language of Sullivan.
Meaning what?
It's the language of Sullivan, not the Creole of Ovan.
No, that's okay. That's a little confusion with what we refer to the language. The people, for instance, in Coruscant, what do they speak?
They speak patois.
Now you see, we have it different. We have the patois as people from Lorient and Eastern Sullivan. I mean, Duvon.
Duval.
Duvon.
They're throughout the Caribbean, the term patois has confusing meanings.
Right.
Usually, if you're in Jamaica or some of the other islands, when you say patois, it's Creole.
Right. There are differences. When you say patois to one person, it means something different.
Right. But in St. Bart, there's a very clear distinction. The patois speakers do not speak Creole.
Yeah.
The patois speakers are
But
speaking.
it's dying out because the younger generation are going to school and they're not learning the old
Yes,
patois.
that's right.
The old
That's
language.
exactly
Now,
right.
two more things. Number one is, my name is Gums, and it's not anywhere in your list.
You came too late.
1788 cents a lot of gums then.
And my paternal grandparents were married here, and I discovered it in this record there. They were married in St. Thomas in the Catholic Church in 1879. And the document says they were from St. Bart's.
Well, there are
And-
lots
and
of
my
gums there
paternal
now.
grandfather was born here.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, well, Deveau has the gums from 1725
Okay.
on
Now,
St. Bart, so
my
don't
last
worry
question
about
is, you showed a picture of an old gentleman there. I knew him. I got
Yes.
to meet him briefly. He's a relative of my wife on my wife's side. If I can
I
get a
think there's
copy of
some
that
people
picture,
here who know him too.
I would be happy if I could get a copy of that picture. His name is,
Great,
his nickname
great
is
uncle.
Barths. I don't know his official name, but his nickname is
Official name, I'll
Barths.
tell you right now, his
Oh,
name
we
is
called
Joseph
him
and Bun
Petit
Grill.
Père.
That's his name.
We called him
Petit
Petit
Père. He's a
Père.
grill.
Joseph
but-
You
Grill.
call who?
Joseph
Père.
Edmond
Grandfather.
Grill.
You call him
AKA
Petit Père?
Yeah, that's what they call him. Ti
Oh,
Papa.
okay.
Ti papa.
Papa.
Well,
Petit Papa.
Papa.
When
Well,
he
they call him
died,
Barths.
many people, they put an announcement in the St. Bart paper and with his official name. And nobody knew what his official name was. So it was big confusion.
We have
We all
the
called
official
him Petit Père.
Yeah.
And finally, in the Spain had passed a law called Real Cedula de Gracia.
Uh-huh.
Without going into too many details, it was an advantageous law for people who moved to Puerto Rico. There's a lot of benefits there, but a lot of people moved from St. Bart's. And in the records, they show the move from St. Bart's with their slaves.
Ah, interesting.
And the law was passed in 1815,
Interesting. That's very interesting.
okay?
Yes.
And a lot of people,
actually
because of the economic conditions in Barths, they sold what they had and moved to Puerto Rico.
Yes, yes, I'm aware
And
of that.
gained from all the benefits which are too numerous to mention here now. It was a very successful program. Also, coincidentally, a lot of people from St. Croix took advantage of it. and almost finish the economies in Croatia. Thank you.
Wow, very interesting information. I brought an article with me that appeared in the Pittsburgh paper just a couple of months ago about Carlos Bernier from Puerto Rico. I don't know if any of you were aware of him. But
I have a cousin in Puerto Rico whose name is Iblis Bernier.
well, Carlos was a great baseball player.
And there's another, there are lots of Berniers in Puerto Rico. Oh, lots and lots of them. I have researched the transfer of slaves, people with their slaves. I had help from several sources to do a research on what happened when the people of St. Bart moved to Puerto Rico with their slaves. I have all of that.
Interesting.
Loads and loads of research. And I was helped by two gentlemen who did actually go into the different places to get information from me. One of them was in Ponce and the other one was in, Guayama.
Interesting. Interesting.
And they actually got together and went and helped me with my research.
Great.
And I have all of that written from the archives in these different churches.
Terrific. Very interesting
It is very,
information.
very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, several of you have talked to me about things that you've been able to find out. I think those are so valuable, and you're so fortunate to have a place where that can be recorded and kept. They're not every place that you could have.
There's a question.
I think we have room, maybe time for a couple more questions. So here's
One's
one.
back here.
Have you, when doing your research, have you came across Quran? I think it's Swedish.
The name?
Quran.
How? Oh, of course.
I didn't see them.
Well, he would have come later. Remember, this list is from 1788, so.
I've done research on the internet to see this anything in France. I've never seen it. I never looked in Swedish, but
No, it's a French name, and the Quérals have been very important members of the St. Bart community. He was mayor. I can't remember his first name at the moment, but I have met him and talked to him. Very entrepreneurial guy. He runs the.
how far does it go back?
Okay. I can't answer that question. And I would recommend the book by DeVoe that you have a copy of here. I don't know whether he mentions Querard. Pardon me? Querrard. Oh, DeVoe. Deveau. And his book is right around the corner.
Yeah, it's right behind the book. On the other end. You see that?
Down here?
Yes. It's a plastic bound. Oh no, blue. No, that's it, isn't it? Or a little further down.
We'll work on it.
A little further down.
We'll work on it. One more question?
Thank you.
Nadine here?
Yes. There was mention of the census of St. Bart's, the first census being available online. Email address.
Sophia knows that. Well, we've got some copies, right?
It's going around.
There is a copy going around, and I can email you the link. I don't. It's a pretty long one. I don't have it off the top of my head. It may be on the form.
The gentleman who was listing how many slaves there were.
He has. Okay.
Hey, Rob, I think the gentleman in the back, he had his hand up at some point. Will we?
No.
Sorry, did you have your hand
I've
up?
looked hard for that. The only thing Swedish you can find at St. Bart is street names. But they even say, the governors even say, there's hardly anybody here who speaks English. I mean, it's Swedish, and we've been here for 16
So I'm sorry, we're going to have to limit it to one more question. I'm told this gentleman's had his hand up for a while, so this is going to have to be our last question.
My mother was Madam Emilia Duran. She was born in St. Bart. She was a hat maker in Frenchtown. And according to our family record, she smuggled 7 Swedish sisters at the same time. And that's where you have the tall, blonde, blue-eyed Frenchies from. I'm an historian, so I've been doing it my whole life.
Thank you so much. Let's give our presenter a big round of applause.